Billionaire's son threw coke at Waitress, not knowing she was his long-lost sister. Sometimes the cruelest moments lead to the most beautiful discoveries. On a rainy Tuesday evening at Murphy's Diner on Route 66, a young waitress named Jessica wiped down tables with the same gentle care her grandmother had taught her years ago. The small silver locket around her neck caught the fluorescent light as she worked, a precious reminder of the family she'd lost in a house fire 23 years ago. She was only 5 then, the sole survivor, adopted by loving strangers who gave her everything except the answers to who she really was. Meanwhile, across town in a glass tower overlooking the city, 42-year-old tech mogul Richard Blackwood stared at an old family photo, his finger tracing the face of his baby sister who'd vanished in that same fire. The guilt still ate at him. He should have saved her. Tonight, these two wounded souls would collide in the most unexpected way, changing everything they thought they knew about loss, family, and second chances. Where are you watching from tonight? Jessica had been working double shifts at Murphy's Diner for 3 months now, saving every penny for community college. At 28, she knew it was late to start, but her adoptive parents, the Hendersons, had always encouraged her dreams. The diner wasn't glamorous, but she found comfort in the routine, brewing fresh coffee, remembering regular customers' orders, and listening to their stories. Old Frank always ordered black coffee and apple pie, sharing tales of his late wife. Mrs. Chen came in every Thursday for tea and would practice her English with Jessica. These simple connections filled the emptiness that had lived in her chest since childhood. The silver locket she wore had been the only thing that survived the fire. Inside was a tiny photo of a little boy with dark hair and serious eyes, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The Hendersons had tried to help her find information about her birth family, but the records were lost, and the case was closed. Sometimes Jessica would catch herself staring at strangers, wondering if they shared her olive skin or the small scar above her left eyebrow. Richard Blackwood lived in a different world entirely. His penthouse apartment overlooked the city like a fortress, walls lined with awards and newspaper clippings celebrating his tech empire. But success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. His parents had died in a car accident 10 years ago, taking with them any remaining hope of finding Jessica, if she was even alive. He'd hired private investigators, donated to missing children's charities, even funded a scholarship program in her name, but nothing brought her back. Tonight was different, though. His business partner had dragged him out for dinner to celebrate closing a major deal. "You need to get out of that tower," Marcus had insisted. "Live a little." They'd driven across town to some dive restaurant Marcus claimed had authentic character, Murphy's Diner. Richard sat uncomfortably in the worn vinyl booth, his expensive suit out of place among the working-class crowd. When Jessica approached their table with a warm smile and a notepad ready, Richard barely looked up from his phone. He was fielding calls from investors, his voice sharp with impatience. "Just bring me whatever's fast," he'd snapped when she tried to explain the evening specials. The kindness in her voice, the same patient tone she used with confused elderly customers, seemed to irritate him further. "Richard, put the phone away," Marcus urged. "You're being rude." But Richard was deep in an argument about quarterly projections, gesturing wildly as he spoke. When Jessica returned with their drinks, his elbow caught the edge of her tray. The glass of Coca-Cola tilted, ice-cold liquid splashing across her white uniform and onto the floor. The diner went quiet. Instead of apologizing, Richard looked at the mess with disgust. "Great, just great. Can't you people do anything right?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but his pride wouldn't let him take them back. He pulled out his wallet and threw a 20 on the table. "Here's your tip. Maybe invest in coordination lessons." Jessica stood frozen, dark soda dripping from her apron, her face burning with embarrassment as other customers stared. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a moment of recognition, like déjà vu, but it passed quickly as his phone rang again. Jessica excused herself to the restroom, her hands shaking as she tried to clean the sticky mess from her uniform. In the mirror, she saw her adoptive mother's words reflected back. "Grace under pressure, sweetheart. That's what makes you special." But tonight, Grace felt impossible. The humiliation stung worse than the cold soda had. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this man's coldness cut deeper. Maybe it was the way he'd looked through her like she didn't exist. When she returned to the dining room, the expensive stranger was gone, leaving only a crumpled 20 and the lingering scent of his cologne. Mrs. Chen, who'd witnessed everything from her corner booth, reached out and squeezed Jessica's hand. "Some people forgot how to see hearts," she said in her gentle broken English. "But you have a good heart. Don't let a mean person make you small." Meanwhile, Richard sat in his Mercedes outside the diner, Marcus's disappointed words echoing in his mind. "That was unnecessary, man. She was just doing her job." But Richard's anger wasn't really about the spilled drink, it was about the gnawing emptiness that followed him everywhere, the guilt that made him lash out at innocent people. He'd built walls so high that kindness felt like weakness. As he drove through the rainy streets, something nagged at him. The waitress's face, the way she'd stood there with such quiet dignity despite his cruelty. There had been something familiar about her olive skin, the shape of her eyes. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Grief made you see ghosts everywhere. Back at the diner, Jessica's shift manager, Pete, found her wiping down tables with extra vigor. "You okay, kid?" Pete had been like a father figure since she'd started working there, always covering for her when she needed time off for interviews or classes. "I'm fine," she lied, but her voice cracked slightly. "Just tired." Pete studied her face. "Look, I saw what happened. That guy was a real piece of work. But you know what? You handled it like a class act. Your parents raised you right." Jessica touched her locket absent-mindedly. "Sometimes I wonder about my birth family, you know? If they're still out there somewhere, what they like. If they'd be proud of who I've become." The question that had haunted her since childhood, would her real family have loved her the way the Hendersons did? That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood on his balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below, thinking about his sister. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, he visited the cemetery where his parents were buried and left flowers on an empty grave marked, "Jessica Blackwood, forever in our hearts." Tomorrow would mark 23 years. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in months. He called the private investigator. "Any new leads on my sister's case?" But the answer was the same as always. "Nothing. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Neither Richard nor Jessica knew it yet, but fate was preparing to weave their stories back together in the most extraordinary way. The next morning brought Jessica's worst fears to life. Her adoptive father, Robert Henderson, collapsed at work with chest pains. The emergency room doctor delivered news that shattered her world. Severe heart disease requiring immediate surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. The man who'd taught her to ride a bike, walked her to school every day, and loved her as fiercely as any biological father could, needed help she couldn't afford to give. Jessica sat beside his hospital bed, holding his weathered hand as machines beeped around them. "Don't you worry about the money, sweetheart," he whispered, though his own eyes showed the fear they were both feeling. "We'll figure something out." But the numbers were staggering. $60,000, more than Jessica would make in 3 years at the diner. She'd already applied for every loan, every program, every grant she could find. The surgery was scheduled for next week, and without it, her father might not see Christmas. That same morning, Richard stood in his office conference room, listening to his financial advisor discuss charitable tax write-offs. "The foundation needs to distribute another $200,000 by year-end," the man droned on. Richard stared out the window at the city below, half listening, until something caught his attention. "What about medical emergencies?" Richard asked suddenly. "People who can't afford surgeries?" His advisor looked surprised. "We could certainly explore that. Any particular reason?" Richard thought about his parents, how helpless he'd felt watching them waste away in the hospital. Money couldn't save them, but maybe it could save someone else's family. Set up a fund. Anonymous donations for people facing medical crises they can't afford. Start researching cases immediately. Meanwhile, Jessica was doing something she'd never done before. She was begging. She'd swallowed her pride and started calling wealthy local businesses, explaining her father's situation, asking for any help they could spare. Most calls ended quickly with polite rejections. Others hung up before she finished speaking. By afternoon, desperation drove her to an idea that made her stomach turn. She'd heard other waitresses talk about online fundraising, sharing heartbreaking stories on social media. It felt like exposing her family's most vulnerable moment to strangers, but what choice did she have? She wrote the post on her phone during her break, tears blurring the words, "My adoptive father saved me from the foster system when I was 5. Now he needs heart surgery, and I'm trying to save him. Please share if you can. Every dollar helps." She attached a photo of Robert teaching her to change a tire in their driveway, both of them laughing at her grease-stained hands. Richard's investigator called that afternoon with routine updates on missing persons cases. "Still working on your sister's file," he said. "Found some old photos from the foster system, but the trail's cold. 23 years is a long time." Something in Richard shifted that day. Maybe it was his father's advice echoing from memory. Success means nothing if you use it to build walls instead of bridges. He thought about the waitress from last night, how her quiet dignity had haunted him. What if someone he loved was struggling somewhere, too proud to ask for help? Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Richard was about to discover that sometimes the universe conspires to heal old wounds in the most unexpected ways. Jessica's social media post had been shared 47 times when something extraordinary happened. Richard's assistant, Sarah, was scrolling through her personal Facebook feed during lunch when the story appeared. The image of a young woman and her adoptive father struck her deeply. It reminded her of her own relationship with her stepfather. She saved the link and, on impulse, forwarded it to Richard with a note, "This might be perfect for your new medical fund." Richard opened the message and found himself staring at a face he'd seen before, the waitress from Murphy's Diner. But this time, she wasn't wearing a stained uniform. She was laughing in her father's arms, and in that moment of pure joy, something clicked. The shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head, the small scar above her left eyebrow, details he'd memorized from a 23-year-old missing person report. His hands trembling, Richard pulled up the old photos his investigator had sent years ago. There, in a grainy picture of children from the Henderson family's adoption paperwork, was a 5-year-old girl with the same olive skin, the same serious eyes that had looked at him with such dignity when he'd humiliated her. The room started spinning. Richard gripped his desk, his breath coming in short gasps. After all these years of searching halfway around the world, his sister had been serving him coffee 20 minutes from his office. And he'd thrown money at her like she was nothing. Without hesitation, Richard grabbed his coat and raced to his car. 23 years of guilt, grief, and desperate searching had led to this moment. He drove to Murphy's Diner like a man possessed, his mind reeling with questions. Did she know? Was she looking for him, too? Would she ever forgive him for last night? At the hospital, Jessica sat in the waiting room filling out loan applications with shaking hands. The social media post had raised $800, nowhere near enough, but every share gave her hope. Her phone buzzed with another notification. Someone had commented, "Is this Jessica Blackwood from the house fire in 1999? Her blood went cold. Nobody knew her birth name except the Hendersons and sealed court records. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. The commenter's profile was private, but the name made her breath catch, Richard Blackwood. Jessica's hands shook as she clicked on the profile. The photos were private, but the face in the tiny profile picture looked familiar in a way that made her chest tight. She pulled out her locket with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal the faded photo of a dark-haired boy. The resemblance was unmistakable. 23 years of wondering, of staring at that photo and imagining what happened to her family, crystallized into one impossible moment. Her brother was alive. He was real. And somehow, he'd found her. Richard burst through the diner doors, his expensive suit wrinkled from the desperate drive. Pete looked up from the register, startled by the wild-eyed man in the doorway. "She's not here," Pete said cautiously. "She's at the hospital." "Which hospital?" Richard's voice cracked with urgency. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Richard was about to face the most important moment of his life, and Jessica was about to discover that family finds you when you need it most. Richard found Jessica in the cardiac wing waiting room, hunched over paperwork with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, he couldn't move. 23 years collapsed into this single breath as he saw his baby sister. No longer the 5-year-old he'd lost, but a woman whose strength and kindness shone despite her fear. "Jessica!" His voice was barely a whisper. She looked up, and their eyes met across the sterile room. In that instant, 23 years of separation melted away. The expensive stranger from last night was gone, replaced by the brother she'd dreamed about since childhood. Without words, they both knew. Richard. Her voice broke on his name, the name she'd whispered to the photo in her locket 1,000 times. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside her chair. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "Last night, the way I treated you, I didn't know, but that's no excuse. I've been searching for you my whole life, and when I finally found you, I was cruel." Jessica touched his face with trembling fingers, tracing features that matched her own. "You were looking for me?" Through tears, Richard told her everything, about the private investigators, the sleepless nights wondering if she'd survived, the guilt that had eaten at him for failing to save her. Jessica shared her story too, about the Hendersons' love, the questions that haunted her, the locket she'd treasured as her only connection to family. "I kept this," she whispered, showing him the photo inside her necklace. Richard laughed through his tears. "That's me. I was 8 when they took that picture." He pulled out his phone and showed her the same photo, digitally restored and framed on his desk for 23 years. The surgery funding suddenly seemed like the smallest gesture in the world. Richard immediately called the hospital's financial department, arranging for complete coverage of Robert's surgery and recovery. But more importantly, he wrapped his sister in the family embrace she'd been missing her whole life. When Robert woke up after successful surgery, he found his daughter holding hands with a stranger who looked just like her. Jessica introduced them simply. "Dad, this is my brother Richard. Richard, this is my father, the man who saved my life and taught me everything about love." Richard spent the next week at Jessica's side, meeting the Hendersons who had given his sister everything he couldn't. There was no jealousy, only infinite gratitude. They'd created the loving, compassionate woman his baby sister had become. 6 months later, Jessica enrolled in business school with Richard's support, not as charity, but as an investment in family. She still worked at Murphy's Diner on weekends, but now it felt different. Pete often caught her touching her locket and smiling, no longer lonely but complete. Richard learned to see people instead of looking through them. He established the Henderson Family Foundation, funding medical emergencies and helping reunite separated families. Every person they helped reminded him that kindness creates ripples that reach farther than we can imagine. Sometimes the most beautiful discoveries come wrapped in our darkest moments. Family isn't just blood, it's love that persists across time, space, and even terrible mistakes. It's forgiveness that heals old wounds and hope that never gives up, even when all seems lost. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and the miracle of second chances.